On April 10th, 1221, the ancient walls of Nishapur shattered like fragile bone under the relentless pounding of Mongol siege engines. Inside a hidden tunnel beneath the chaos, Mujir al-Mulk, the city's proud governor, crouched in the damp darkness, his heart pounding as screams echoed from above. But the Mongols, driven by a vengeance that knew no mercy, dragged him out into the blinding light, his robes torn, his dignity stripped. They executed him in ways too vile to whisper, his body left as a broken symbol of a city's doom. This was no ordinary conquest. It was annihilation, born from a single arrow's fatal flight. The shadows of that day still haunt the annals of history, pulling us into their grip. If you're drawn to these unforgiving truths, stay with Brooding History. Hit like if the weight settles on you, subscribe for the depths ahead. Share this echo with those who seek the unseen, and comment what lingers in your mind. Nishapur, jewel of Khorasan in the vast Khwarezmian Empire, stood as a beacon of Persian splendor in the early 13th century. Nestled along the Silk Road in what is now northeastern Iran, its markets buzzed with traders from Baghdad to Beijing, exchanging turquoise gems, intricate pottery, and silken textiles under the watchful eyes of towering minarets. Scholars flocked to its libraries, delving into astronomy, poetry, and medicine, while Sufi mystics like the revered poet Attar wandered its rose-scented gardens, pondering the soul's eternal quest. But beneath this cultural tapestry lay a rigid hierarchy. The Khwarezm Shah Muhammad II ruled from afar, his authority enforced by local governors like Mujir al-Mulk, who commanded loyalty from nobles, merchants, and a militia swollen with refugees fleeing the gathering storm. The storm arrived in the form of Genghis Khan, the unyielding conqueror whose Mongol hordes had already swept across northern China and now turned westward, fueled by an insult that ignited war. In 1218, a caravan of Mongol merchants was slaughtered in Otrar by order of its governor, a brazen act that provoked Genghis's wrath. By 1220, his armies under generals Jebe and Subutai reached Nishapur, demanding provisions and submission. The city complied at first, watching the riders depart, yet whispers of Mongol setbacks spread like wildfire, emboldening the people to rebel. They fortified their 40-foot walls, manned by 12,000 archers at each gate, and prepared for defiance. Enter Tokuchar, Genghis Khan's favored son-in-law, married to his daughter Tümelün, a woman of fierce spirit raised in the harsh steppes where survival demanded iron resolve. In November 1220, Tokuchar led 10,000 men to quell the uprising, approaching Nishapur's gates with demands for surrender. The governor, Mujir al-Mulk, refused, his pride mirroring the city's ancient defiance. Arrows rained down, one pierced Tokuchar's throat, felling him before his warriors. His body lay unrecognized in the dust as the Mongols retreated, but news of his death raced to Genghis, who wept bitterly, not from weakness but from a rage that would consume worlds. Genghis entrusted vengeance to his youngest son, Tolui, a brilliant tactician whose campaigns would etch terror into history's pages. With an army of perhaps 50,000 seasoned horsemen, Chinese engineers wielding catapults that hurled 300-pound boulders, and naphtha throwers spewing fire, Tolui marched on Nishapur in the spring of 1221. The city, now a refuge for tens of thousands fleeing other fallen strongholds, braced for the onslaught. Its population, swollen to maybe 200,000, included nobles clinging to their estates, merchants hoarding goods, and common folk praying to Allah for deliverance. Social divides deepened. The elite in their palaces schemed for mercy, while the poor manned the walls, their fates intertwined in the empire's crumbling power structure. As Tolui's forces encircled the city, bombarding it for days with unceasing fury, the air filled with the crack of stone on stone, the acrid smoke of burning pitch. Defenders repelled wave after wave, but cracks appeared, not just in the walls, but in their resolve. An envoy, the chief Qadi Rukn al-Din, rode out pleading for quarter, offering tribute in gold and slaves. Tolui turned him away, his eyes cold with the memory of Tokuchar's blood. The breach came swiftly, Mongols pouring through like a tidal wave of death. What followed tested the limits of human endurance. The inhabitants, from the highest noble to the lowliest child, were herded onto the plains outside the city. Tümelün, the widowed princess, arrived with her bodyguard. Her grief twisted into unrelenting fury. She oversaw the slaughter, ensuring no mercy tainted the revenge. Heads were severed, piled into grotesque pyramids, men's in one mound, women's in another, children's in a third, rising as monuments to Mongol justice. Even cats and dogs fell to the blade. The land was sown with barley over the ruins, erasing centuries of civilization. But amid this carnage, whispers of survival emerged. 400 artisans spared, marched to distant lands as slaves. Was this a flicker of pragmatism in the abyss, or merely a cruel extension of suffering? Of the governor's fate, dragged from his hiding place, hinted at deeper horrors yet to unfold. The governor, Mujir al-Mulk, known in some chronicles as Sharaf al-Din Amir Majlis, had gambled everything on defiance. His household, the closest thing Nishapur possessed to a royal family under Khwarezmian rule, lived in opulent palaces amid gardens heavy with the scent of roses and jasmine. Wives, daughters, sons, extended kin, and loyal retainers filled those halls, people accustomed to silk robes, silver platters, and the deference of servants. They represented the pinnacle of local power, the thread connecting the distant Shah to the city's daily life. When the walls fell, that thread snapped. Tolui's warriors stormed through the breach, their hooves churning the blood-soaked streets into mud. The air thickened with smoke and the metallic tang of slaughter. Families huddled in courtyards, basements behind barred doors, praying, weeping, bargaining with fate. No bargain was accepted. The Mongols dragged them into the open, separating men from women, children from parents. Swords flashed in the pale spring light. Heads rolled, bodies crumpled. The governor himself, pulled from his tunnel like a rat from its burrow, met a fate reserved for those who had dared strike at Mongol royalty. His end came slowly, deliberately, torture that broke body and spirit before the final mercy of death. But the true architect of vengeance was not Tolui alone. The widowed Tümelün arrived, her face a mask of steppe-hardened grief, her presence a storm cloud over the ruins. As the daughter of Genghis Khan and wife of the fallen Tokuchar, she carried the authority of the great Khan himself. Chroniclers record her overseeing the massacre with unyielding command. She demanded no quarter, no exceptions. Every living thing, man, woman, child, even the city's cats and dogs, was to pay for the arrow that took her husband. The inhabitants were herded to the plains beyond the shattered gates. There, in organized horror, the killing unfolded over days. Each Mongol soldier received an allotment, 300 or 400 souls to dispatch. Axes rose and fell. The ground drank deep. Pyramids of skulls rose as monuments, separate mounds for men, for women, for children. Silent witnesses to a rage that erased distinction. The air reeked of copper and decay. Dust settled on the lifeless faces of scholars, merchants, beggars, nobles alike. The governor's family, once shielded by status, shared the same fate as the lowliest refugee. No records survive of pleas from his wives or daughters. If they cried out, the wind carried their voices away unanswered. Their blood mingled with the rest, soaking the earth that would soon be ploughed under with barley, as if to mock the city's former fertility. Only a handful escaped the blade. 400 artisans, craftsmen whose skills the Mongols deemed useful. Potters, weavers, metalworkers, they were bound and marched away to distant camps, their expertise now property of the conquerors. The rest vanished into oblivion. The population, swollen by refugees to perhaps 200,000, dwindled to silence. Modern estimates temper the chronicler's wild claims of 1 or 2 million dead, yet the scale remains catastrophic. A city of light reduced to ash and bone. Amid the carnage, one image haunts above all. Tümelün, standing on the bloodied plain, watching as the last breaths left Nishapur. Her grief, once personal, had become policy. The Mongols understood revenge as a message written in corpses. Kill one of their own, and entire worlds paid the price. The governor's palace, once a seat of power, stood empty, its treasures looted, its walls scarred by catapult stones. What drives a daughter of the steppes to demand such totality? Was it love, twisted into fury, or the cold calculation of empire? The scars of Nishapur lingered far beyond 1221. Generations would speak of it in hushed tones, a warning etched into the land itself. The destruction was not random cruelty. It was deliberate erasure, a warning to every city that might still harbor resistance. Yet even as the smoke rose, whispers of survival flickered in the shadows, hidden tunnels, distant villages, the faint hope that some fragment of Nishapur's soul endured. But for the governor's line, the royal heart of the city, there was only silence. Their names faded, their blood soaked into the soil, their legacy reduced to the memory of a single arrow, and the vengeance it unleashed. The silence that followed the massacre was not peace. It was absence. Where once the call to prayer rose 5 times a day from minarets that pierced the sky, now only wind moved through the broken arches. Nishapur, for centuries a living archive of Persian genius, lay gutted. The libraries, repositories of manuscripts older than the city itself, burned or were trampled into pulp beneath Mongol boots. Scrolls of mathematics, poetry, theology, the works of Avicenna and Al-Farabi, reduced to ash that drifted across the plain like grey snow. The observatory, where astronomers once charted the heavens with instruments of brass and wood, stood empty, its dome cracked open to the indifferent stars. Tolui did not linger. His orders were clear: destroy, then move on. The army divided the spoils, horses, gold, weapons, the 400 surviving craftsmen, and turned westward, leaving behind a landscape that no longer resembled a city. The barley they sowed over the ruins was not an act of mockery alone, it was practical. The Mongols understood how to erase memory from the land. A generation later, travelers would pass through what had been Nishapur and see only fields, perhaps a few weathered stones half buried in soil, and wonder if the stories were true. Yet the stories persisted, carried on the tongues of survivors who had fled before the final siege or hidden in distant villages. They spoke of the governor's family in hushed reverence and horror. Mujir al-Mulk had not been merely a local official. As vizier and governor, he embodied the Khwarezmian court in miniature, his household a microcosm of royal splendor, complete with concubines, eunuchs, poets, and tutors for his sons. His daughters, raised in seclusion, yet educated in the finest traditions, were said to possess the grace and learning that once defined Persian nobility. When the Mongols dragged them into the light, no distinction was made between bloodline and commoner. The blade fell without hesitation. All of this served a larger purpose. Genghis Khan had turned personal loss into imperial doctrine. The death of Tokuchar was not an isolated tragedy. It became precedent. From that moment forward, any resistance, any insult, any arrow aimed at Mongol royalty would summon annihilation on a scale designed to break the will of entire nations. Nishapur was the loudest of those warnings. The city had not simply been defeated, it had been unmade. Its people, its culture, its very name were to serve as a lesson written in absence. The psychological wound cut deeper than the physical. Families across Khorasan began to internalize the new reality. Defiance meant extinction. Cities that once boasted of independence now sent envoys bearing tribute before the first Mongol scout appeared on the horizon. Fear became policy. The Khwarezmian Empire, already fractured by internal rivalries and the aging Shah's erratic rule, collapsed under the weight of that terror. One by one, Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, Herat, each suffered variations of the same fate. Yet Nishapur remained the exemplar, the place where vengeance reached its most complete expression. Even the spared artisans carried the trauma forward. Marched across the steppe to Karakorum or other Mongol strongholds, they labored in captivity, their hands shaping vessels and weapons for the very empire that had destroyed their world. Some may have whispered the old poems of Attar in the darkness of their tents, clinging to fragments of what had been lost. Others, broken by years of servitude, forgot the verses entirely. What does it mean to belong to a people whose city was erased so thoroughly that even the earth was instructed to forget it? How long does the silence last before new voices rise from the ruins? The Mongols believed the answer was forever. They were wrong. The story of Nishapur's royal family does not end with the pyramids of skulls. It lingers in the way power reshapes itself after catastrophe. The governor's line was extinguished, But the idea of resistance, of pride, of a city that dared say no, did not vanish so easily. It smoldered beneath the barley fields, waiting for the wind to change. And the wind always changes. The wind that always changes carried more than dust across the barley fields of Nishapur. It carried the memory of a single act of resistance and the price exacted for it. The arrow that killed Tokuchar had not been fired by Mujir al-Mulk himself. No chronicle names the archer. It could have been any man on the wall, a soldier, a merchant pressed into service, a boy who had never drawn a bow before that day. Yet the punishment fell on the entire city, and most heavily on its ruling household. The governor's family paid not for their own hands, but for the collective defiance they had failed to suppress. In the Mongol worldview, hierarchy was absolute. A ruler answered for his subjects, a father for his sons, a husband for his wives and daughters. When the people of Nishapur refused surrender, they spoke with one voice, and that voice belonged to Mujir al-Mulk. His palace became the symbolic center of the crime. His wives, daughters, and female kin were not spared the fate of the common women. Tümelün, herself a daughter of the great Khan, understood this logic perfectly. She had been raised in a world where status offered no shield from vengeance, only a higher platform from which to fall. The princess watched as the governor's household was brought before her. If any mercy flickered in her heart, it was extinguished by the memory of Tokuchar's body lying in the dust, an arrow through his throat. The execution of the women and children was methodical, almost ritualistic. Chroniclers, writing decades later, record that the Mongols separated the females from the rest, then divided them further. Noble women from commoners, young from old. No distinction altered the outcome. Swords and axes did their work. Some accounts speak of the governor's daughters being slain before their mother's eyes, a cruelty designed to compound the agony. Others describe the women being bound and forced to watch the slaughter of their sons, then dispatch themselves. The details vary, but the intention never does. To make the pain echo through time, to ensure that no family line, no memory of resistance could take root again. This was not mindless brutality. It was theater on a continental scale. Genghis Khan and his successors understood the power of spectacle. The pyramids of skulls were not hidden, they were built to be seen from afar, visible for miles across the plain. Travelers, merchants, refugees, anyone who passed the site would carry the image away with them. Word spread faster than armies. Nishapur had been erased, its royal family had been erased. The message was unmistakable: submit or vanish. The psychological impact rippled outward for centuries. In the Persian-speaking world, Nishapur became synonymous with total loss. Poets who survived the wider Mongol invasions, men like Sadi and Rumi, wrote of ruined cities and broken lineages with a melancholy that echoes the fate of Mujir al-Mulk's household. Even today, in the literature of Iran and Central Asia, the name Nishapur conjures not only turquoise and poetry, but the silence that followed the storm. The royal family's extinction was not merely a casualty of war, it was the deliberate severing of a cultural artery. Yet the Mongols themselves were not untouched. Tümelün, having overseen the vengeance, returned to the steppe carrying the weight of what she had done. Grief had not been sated, it had been redirected. The daughter of Genghis Khan lived out her days in a world where love and destruction were forever entwined. Her children, raised in the shadow of that vengeance, would inherit both the empire and its ghosts. The barley grew. Seasons turned. The city's name faded from everyday speech, replaced by tales told in lowered voices. But beneath the soil, the bones remained, layer upon layer of them, whispering that history does not forgive. It remembers, and sometimes it waits. How does a people rebuild identity after the deliberate murder of their highest representatives? When the lineage that once gave a city its face is severed, what fills the void? The answer for Nishapur would not come quickly. It would come in fragments, through hidden manuscripts, through oral traditions, through the slow return of life to a place that had been declared dead. But that return belonged to another chapter, one written not in blood, but in stubborn, quiet endurance. The barley fields that covered Nishapur's ruins did not remain empty forever. Life, stubborn and patient, began to creep back. Within a few decades, small clusters of tents appeared on the outskirts. Survivors from nearby villages, nomads who had watched the destruction from distant hills, and refugees who had fled before the final siege returned in cautious waves. They did not rebuild on the exact site of the old city. The ground still felt cursed, the air too heavy with memory. Instead, they settled a short distance away, calling the new place Nishapur still, as if the name itself refused to die. Yet the royal family's story did not vanish with the skulls. It became part of the soil's quiet lore. Oral traditions carried fragments forward. The governor's daughters, said to have been beautiful and learned, were remembered in lullabies as tragic figures whose laughter once filled palace gardens. Mujir al-Mulk himself, transformed into a cautionary archetype, the proud man who stood too tall when the storm arrived. In the centuries that followed, Persian chroniclers like Juvaini and Rashid al-Din, writing under Mongol patronage, recorded the massacre with clinical precision, yet even they could not entirely strip the event of its emotional weight. The death of an entire household became a symbol of what happens when pride meets overwhelming force. The Mongol Empire itself, having sown such terror, eventually softened around the edges. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his successors adopted elements of the cultures they had conquered. Ilkhanid rulers in Persia, descendants of the same lineage that had ordered Nishapur's destruction, became patrons of Persian art, science, and architecture. By the late 13th century, the very dynasty that had raised cities was building observatories, translating Greek texts, and commissioning illuminated manuscripts. The circle was cruelly poetic. The conquerors who had once burned libraries now preserved them. But for Nishapur, the healing was slower, more uneven. The new settlement grew into a modest town, never again reaching the splendor of its pre-1221 days. The turquoise mines continued to yield their blue-green stone, and the poets kept coming, most famously Omar Khayyam, born in the city in the late 11th century, whose verses on fate and impermanence took on new resonance after the Mongol storm. Later still, in the 13th century, the Sufi mystic Farid al-Din Attar, already a revered figure before the invasion, became legend. Tradition holds that he was killed during the massacre, refusing to convert or submit, though some accounts place his death earlier. Whether he perished in 1221 or not, his poetry, especially the Conference of the Birds, speaks to a spiritual resilience that outlasted physical ruin. The governor's lineage, however, left no such poetic trace. No descendants emerged to reclaim titles or estates. The royal family of Nishapur was extinguished in the plain outside the walls, their bloodline severed as completely as the city's old minarets. In time, even the pyramids of skulls weathered away, scattered by wind, carried off by animals, dissolved into the earth. Yet the absence itself became a monument. Travelers in the Timurid and Safavid eras would pause at the site and murmur prayers, half in mourning for what was lost, half in dread of what power could still do. The psychological legacy proved more enduring than stone. Across Khorasan and beyond, the memory of Nishapur shaped a new kind of caution. Cities learned to negotiate rather than resist. Rulers learned to offer tribute before demands were made. The Mongol invasions, of which Nishapur was one of the most complete examples, accelerated the centralization of power in the Persian world, first under Mongol overlords, then under their Persianized successors. The old patchwork of semi-independent governors and city-states gave way to larger, more hierarchical empires. In a bitter irony, the very destruction that aimed to erase resistance helped forge the structures that would define the region for centuries. Even today, when archaeologists sift through the soil near modern Nishapur, they occasionally uncover fragments, pottery shards, a broken tile, the occasional human bone. That whisper of 1221. The city has never fully forgotten. Neither has history. What does it mean when a single act of violence erases not just lives, but the future those lives might have built? When an entire family's story ends in a single spring week, does the silence that follows carry its own kind of weight? The final chapter of Nishapur's royal tragedy is not one of restoration, but of endurance through memory. Memory that refuses to let the past be buried entirely beneath barley or time. The barley fields of Nishapur have long since given way to orchards, streets, and the quiet hum of a modern city that bears the same ancient name. Today's Nishapur, rebuilt several kilometers from the original site, is a place of turquoise workshops, carpet bazaars, and the steady rhythm of daily life in northeastern Iran. Tourists walk the mausoleums of Omar Khayyam and Farid al-Din Attar, leaving flowers and whispered verses. Few pause to consider that beneath the soil a few miles away lies the true grave of the city that once stood there, a grave marked not by stone, but by absence. The royal family of Nishapur vanished so completely that no single grave, no inscription, no surviving child carries their name forward. Mujir al-Mulk, his wives, his daughters, his sons. All were swallowed by the plain in April 1221. Their blood became part of the land, their voices part of the wind that still moves across Khorasan. In the end, the Mongols succeeded in what they intended. They severed the line. No descendant ever rose to reclaim the governor's palace. No claimant appeared centuries later with a faded seal or a remembered title. The household that once represented the pride and power of a Silk Road jewel was extinguished in a single, merciless season. Yet history does not allow total erasure. The story itself endures, carried in Persian chronicles, in the guarded memories of families who trace their roots to Khorasan, in the cautionary tone that still lingers when elders speak of the Mongols. Nishapur became more than a city, it became a parable. A reminder that pride, when it stands alone against overwhelming force, can cost everything. That vengeance, when it is absolute, leaves wounds not only in the defeated, but in the victors. That even empires built on terror eventually bend toward the cultures they once sought to destroy. Tümelün, the princess whose grief fueled the massacre, fades from the records after her return to the steppe. Her name appears briefly in genealogies, linked to descendants who ruled in the Ilkhanate. Yet she remains a shadow, defined not by her life, but by the single act of retribution she oversaw. Genghis Khan himself died 6 years later in 1227, still carrying the memory of every son-in-law, every arrow, every city that had dared resist. The empire he built would fracture, reform, and eventually dissolve, leaving behind a vast patchwork of nations shaped as much by the terror he unleashed as by the peace that followed. In the quiet of modern Nishapur, when the call to prayer drifts over rooftops at dusk, there is a continuity the Mongols could not break. The turquoise still gleams. The poets still speak of impermanence and the soul's journey. The city's spirit, though scarred, refused to be buried beneath barley forever. The royal family may be gone, their names lost to the wind, but the idea they represented, a cultured, proud, ancient people who dared to stand, lingers in every rebuilt wall, every verse recited, every child born under these same skies. The past does not heal, it simply learns to breathe again, quieter, more careful, yet unbroken. The shadows of history still stretch into our world. If this story stayed with you, like it, subscribe to Brooding History, share it onward, and leave your voice in the comments. What remains when everything is taken? What would you have done beneath those walls in the spring of 1221? Speak below, the darkness remembers. So do we.